how can those decision systems that we are advocating here incorporate ignorance?
You want me to say something?
Yeah, any one of you can say something. And make sure your things are on your mic.
Yeah, let's see. Can you hear me out there?
Okay.
Excellent. I think it's useful to distinguish two situations. There are more. But one situation is we don't know how smoking causes cancer. Just cancer is still pretty much mysterious, but we for sure know that smoking causes cancer. So these are things that you can say with plain words. I just did it. You can even, in some situations, make very precise models where certain things are just formulated so that, yes, it's clear that's the case. And other things, they come with perhaps probability or perhaps just possibility, whatever. So that's one way to communicate uncertainty. The much more interesting, and it's a very important one, but the much more interesting one is when you have paradoxes. When you have a certain way of looking at things that makes a lot of sense, and there's another way of looking at things, also makes a lot of sense, but the two things are not really compatible. Now, a big example of this is the relation between relativity theory and quantum mechanics in physics. You have much smaller examples. I can give you many. In economics, basically, marketing would be useless because competition just determines the price and that's it. On the other hand, if you look at it from a management perspective, you would be a fool if you would run a business without marketing. So you can say contradictions, but they are not stupid contradictions. It's not like, here's a mistake, I'll fix it. You just have to live with some paradox. The second kind of uncertainty, or uncertainty communication, emotionally is more difficult to handle if you must take a decision. But I think both things are possible, and both things are very important.
So, following up on this, in both, Steve and Maja, maybe you can say something about, because you're dealing with real-world situation and obviously also with potential decision makers. So how would you encounter or address sort of the ignorance of somebody you work with who is in the position to make a decision, put a road into Bali, or, start setting the wrong kind of quota? How are you addressing those things?
So one of the things I actually wanted to say earlier with respect to when we take a complex adaptive.
Speak louder.
I did turn it on.
Okay.
Maybe I turn it off again. Like that?
Yeah.
There we go.
Magic.
Magic. Technology. When we take a complex adaptive systems perspective, so we think about governing these systems also more in terms of shaping the contexts rather than designing strategies or solutions. And through shaping the context, we give a different kind of space in which these processes can evolve. So we don't get around the ignorance and kind of a try and error in some way, but we can shape kind of the opportunity spaces or the potential outcomes through shaping those contexts. And that would be one way. If I would address such a person or talk to such a person, I guess there's multiple ways in thinking about the complexity of the systems. One, in engaging in ways to understand what are the sources of those uncertainties, in particular bringing in humans and human behavior more into how we understand those systems. There's been lots of calls that we need more human adaptive behavior and climate change models and understandings, but we haven't made much progress in that.
Might be a good way. I don't know whether, probably not everybody in the room knows that, he alluded at it very briefly. So Steve studied that system that evolved for 1,000 years and wrote the book on it. And the role of cultural practices in actually organizing that system. So you did that, and then, after that book became a classic, he figured out, I can build a small model and actually scientifically prove that they knew what they were doing. So is this a way that those kind of models that could demonstrate that what we would call long-term practices actually know what they are doing, and sometimes sort of our technocratic approach does not? Would that be a kind of way?
It's been my experience. We, with the Greek Revolution, it was an enormous challenge to try to get more food to the people, grow more rice. This is in the 70s and 80s. And so lots of debate, lots of effort on the Asian Bank and so forth, emphasizing how can we get more nitrogen to the field. So a friend of mine and I, who's a biological oceanographer, went down and collected samples from the coral growing on the reefs around Bali, and took this stable nitrogen isotope signature of the algae growing on the coral, because we noticed that the coral was, most of it was dead or dying. So nitrogen comes in, two flavors, right? 14 and 15 isotope, and that signature tells you the source. So guess what? The source of the algae that was killing the coral was not from the ocean. It was from the fertilizer that the farmers were being instructed to spend their hard-earned rupees on, to pour onto the fields in large quantities. And so with that very simple test, you could see, well, actually it's enormously superfluous. So I think if you step back and just sort of look at what, again, the core strain idea, the very simple systems dynamics, what's going on, then you could probably test to find out, right, how much you know, to understand the process that we're busily creating.
So there's another question that sort of would follow up on that based on your experience, and I think it's a very important one, looking at the future, that was about the role of sort of the arts and cultural practices in advocating and sort of accelerating those sustainability transitions. In the sense, sort of from your experience, maybe you can sort of tell a little bit about that, how tightly interwoven very complicated cultural practices were with the actual functioning of that society in Bali. So you wouldn't have that efficient food production system without the cultural practices that go with it.
Yeah, well, the Balinese have a religion that's kind of built on water and nature and things like that. And that was meant to be set aside in order to allow economic development to occur. But it created instead explosions of rice pests and chaos in irrigation. And there was time, fortunately, that discovery happened soon enough, so that there was time for the Asian Development Bank to back off. In fact, I can tell you kind of some funny thing. In Sharjah, in the United Emirates, there will be an installation, an exhibition. The Sharjah Triennale will be inaugurated this year, and they're going to build a model of the Balinese water temple system in the desert to tell that story. They wanted copies of the initial letters from the Asian Development Bank saying, please don't complain anymore about our wonderful project, right? And I said, well, you'll embarrass them if you put those letters up. But anyway, they're going to do it. So it's now being held up as an example of, I guess, how that recovery happened. And if you happen to be dropping by in Dubai, go have a look. It's opening on the 9th of November, apparently. It's one of the funniest things that's ever happened in my life, that there would be an Arab exhibition on Balinese water temples in the desert. Anyway, couldn't resist.
No, I think it's an important story, because we are talking about, Maja was saying that we don't even have the word for those integrated systems. And of course, that raises the question, what needs to be included? So in your work, did you encounter similar stories that Steve had, that actually the old traditional practices contained a lot of knowledge that we are sort of very deliberately, carefully reacquire through scientific methods?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, the story of poverty in the Pamir Mountains is very similar to the Balinese, and the role of cultural practices. Actually now a poverty trap. Explorations, which are very simple and stylized. Cultural practices was one of the three dimensions. So it was the ecological dimension, the economic, financial dimension, and the cultural practices.
But I want to say just one thing about that, because so you might conclude you've got to send anthropologists all over the world and have them spend many months studying these systems. Actually, the point of the the model I showed you is you can sit down in front of your computer, count up the distribution of patches in the mosaics that you can see from Google Earth, and discover whether it is at a critical transition. Right? There are things like that that are possible.
But it's not only the knowledge that is transmitted through that, but also the practices themselves create trust and create a system of interacting with the environment that maintains its diversity and its productivity. So it goes beyond the knowledge.
So what is interesting, so it came out yesterday. So when I went to the airport in Arizona, so we heard an interview. So Nobel Prize winning economist Robert Shiller just published a new book where he emphasized that economists basically have been totally misled by just looking at a data source that consists of large tables of numbers, and that he's now advocating that they need to incorporate the role of narratives into economics as a way to understand what really goes on the ground. So, which seems to, be right what we are talking about here. So, Carlo, maybe in what way could a decision theater framework actually be a technology that allows sort of for the merger of quantitative data and models and narratives?
I think we have to find out. You asked in what way. If you had asked, does it help us to do this? I would say, of course. Now, if you ask in which way, that's not so easy anymore. But I want to say something about, something important, but in a way surprising. I came to this decision theater thinking, approach, method from the perspective of decision support. So my question was, here I have somebody who has to take a momentous decision, little time, big confusion. We scientists, how can we, not efficiently, effectively, in a meaningful way, support such people? It turns out you can use exactly the same instrument in the other direction, because the people with whom you talk, at least in general, are not idiots. So a decision maker who is in a position to decide whether to sink Lehman Brothers or not is most likely to be a person with a lot of background knowledge and a lot of narratives in the back of her or his mind. And by interacting with these people as a researcher, you learn again. And the difficult thing is that it's an emotional adventure. So you asked in what way, and I give only a very partial answer, but the answer is about emotions. If you are certain about something, but then your certainty is shattered, that's an emotionally difficult moment. It's not going to kill you as a rule, but it's not easy emotionally to deal with this kind of situation. We as scientists have certain certainties, some certainties, and if those are shattered, it's emotionally difficult for us. The decision maker has other certainties, and if his certainties are shattered, it's emotionally difficult for him. The decision theater creates a social setting, and that's an experience we have made in several situations. We have run quite a few of these things by now. The conversation, as long as it's a reasonably civilized conversation, helps people to accept that sort of emotional tension. And that's important because once you realize, I don't really know enough to take the right decision, you have two reactions. One reaction is, to hell, I'll just do something. And the other reaction is, I will not act. And both reactions are wrong. To be able emotionally to deal with a situation where you have this tension, but to continue to argue, to reason, and then to act is difficult. And the group situation supported with the kind of technology we today have available can really be helpful in this. So once again, yes, I think we can, let's say, combine narratives and formalized models. There are many ways of doing so. I don't think there's one way, but people tend to underestimate the emotional stress into which you get when you speak about a real decision situation with real consequences, and partial knowledge. If you have total ignorance, well, okay. If you have total knowledge, you're fine. But you have partial ignorance, partial knowledge, that's the hard part. And in this process, I think some of this combination does actually happen.
So this would be sort of a nice segue to another concern that was raised here that you want us to address. And so we have made an argument here, I think all of us in various forms, that in order to really get a grip on sustainability, we need to take what we know from complexity theory seriously. And the question then, when you talk about a complex systems, where are the boundaries of that systems, particularly when it goes into decision making. And so several sort of comments here about how can we actually facilitate collaborations that go beyond the academic. And I think what Carlo was just saying, and in a way what Steve was showing was this very simple model, that this actually is not something that makes this inclusion difficult, rather the opposite. It makes it actually much more open to bring in people who are in NGOs, in advocacy. So all of you have worked with those people. So what is your experience so that you basically can address this concern? Does complex systems thinking actually make it easier to talk people outside of academia? So that's sort of the question I take from that. Or not? Or is it such an esoteric thing that everybody just goes away?
I think it depends on the condition. The condition is whether you can start or build on a basis of trust. If this is the case, then it helps. Very often, you don't have that basis of trust. I'm not speaking now about, hatred and all this crazy stuff. It's just, for the first time in my life, I meet somebody, I know very little about the other person, where should the trust come from? And it is often underestimated how important it is, if the trust is not just there for whatever reason, to work on it, to build that trust. And the very important element, which is somehow painful for scientists, is to understand that you create trust by showing your own ignorance. As long as you have this attitude of, I know everything about this case, and you speak with somebody who is in reality dealing with this thing, he will not trust you. And he will be right not to trust you. And that enables the learning process in both directions.
So Steve, what was the reaction of the Berlinese once you showed them your model?
My colleague, the ecologist, likes to quote the reaction of the high priest of the temple, who, having been shown the model for the first time, they brought an apple up, and Jim was very proud, and we translated it, and he looked at it, and Jim said, "What do you think?" And the Jirogade said, "You don't, by any stretch of the imagination, think that it's an accident that you came here." Yeah, well, it's a tool for them. It's a tool for them to kind of partly to deal with consultants, but also just another way to understand how their system works. Yeah.
Maja, any experiences?
I think the answer is a yes and a no. I think there's increasing recognition of the need to take complexity into account, and there's more willingness to take complexity into account than taking intertwinedness into account, actually. Interestingly, the Stockholm Resilience Center has been, over the last few years, worked a lot with SIDA, which is the Swedish Development Agency, and they requested they want to kind of engage more, bring more complexity to their development programs. And there's been the Green Carbon Fund has commissioned a paper on looking at how a complexity perspective can help with climate change adaptation projects. But then, once confronted with complexity or more complex thoughts, there's often this reaction that I think you mentioned in the beginning, right? That people then do not want to engage, and they want the simple, they like the simple models. Mm-hmm. And I think complexity science has been very good in finding these underlying kind of simple rules, mechanisms, processes in the coarse graining. I think what we need to do more is actually really get into the dirtiness of the real world and into those complex real-world situations, and then use that knowledge to generalize in a way that kind of is what I would call like contextualized generalizations. So really move, I think we're very good on the theoretical level. We're very good in the narratives and the detailed. I think what we miss is kind of the level in between.
I just want to add something which I find intriguing and important. There's one area where nearly everybody totally gets the complexity issue, and that's war. If you discuss a war situation with people who may hate war or love war, be on one side or the other, it doesn't matter. People understand the future is not determined. You need to take into account a myriad of elements, and you cannot really know. War is a complex thing. And there is a beautiful phrase which says, any military strategy is good unless you actually meet the enemy. It's not to say you don't need a strategy, but it's interesting that nobody, when they discuss about what to do about Afghanistan or Syria or these places, comes with the attitude of, we know what is the best solution, we can prove it. Everybody knows this is foolish. But in most other areas, lots of people somehow think, no, life is such that I can know with clarity, this is the way to go, and I tell the other guy and he will understand, and that's it. I find it somehow sad that only in the terrible situation of war, you can take for granted that people understand what a complex situation is.
So when I worked on irrigation systems in Central Asia, I worked with farmers and fishers on the ground. I worked with governors at kind of a regional level in between, and I worked with the national technocrats and decision makers. And one of the interesting insights was that the local farmers on the ground are very well aware of the complexity and the adaptiveness. And the further you walked up towards the decision makers and technocrats, the more it was completely ununderstandable for them. It was an insight to realize that maybe with climate change, the predictions based on past runoff might not be as accurate any longer. That was as far as kind of an acceptance of uncertainty would go. And that we can fix, right?
Okay, so we are pretty close to the absolute need to get ethanol-based substances in our system, but are there any questions that you didn't write down that you're dying to ask the panel? Of course, you can ask the questions, any one of the speakers individually over drinks.
Hi, thank you very much for your talks and your very interesting insights. Just one thing, like we talked a lot about the NGOs and decision-making process, and you, Maja, talked about interest groups and how competing interests can result in a sustainable regime. I was wondering if there was any complexity science study on protest movements and how they managed to, achieve their goal with competing competitors.
So a lot of the research on transformations, social ecological transformations, builds on the literature on social movements and trying to learn from social movements how social innovations kind of can emerge or whatever, and how they then kind of scale up or whatever you want to call it, right? Kind of manifest themselves within a system. So that work of Francis Westley, for example. Interesting.
So there are two people of the 68 generations. Do you have any stories to tell? Okay, maybe that's the question for the drinks. Okay, so let me sort of bring that to a close. Thanks everyone for attending, and we hope you can join us in the courtyard for some refreshments and further discussion. And you can see that given the questions and the responses that we didn't select an unimportant topic. Whether we will be able to make an important contribution remains to be seen, but that is why we have institutions such as the Hub here in Vienna to push those boundaries and those conversations. So thanks for your attention.